Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of On the Margin with my co-host Boris Sobrado. This week we're talking to Esfandyar, who is the CEO and founder of Bourse Bazaar Foundation, which is an economic think tank that produces economic research on many topics, but with a special focus on the impact of sanctions. Today we're going to talk about Iran, which is a fascinating topic because in terms of landmass, it's bigger than France, with a population similar to that of Germany, and in terms of GDP, it ranks in the top 20 in the world, and yet it's a bit of a mystery within Europe as to why Iran plays the global role of pariah state, especially from a Western perspective. But before we step into discussing that in more detail, Esfandyar, can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show. Delighted to be here. So I'm the founder and CEO of the Bourse Bazaar Foundation. It's an economic think tank. And for the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of research about the effects of sanctions on Iran's economy. I look at that issue from a policy standpoint. So we are trying to help policymakers in Iran, in Europe, in the United States find common ground, understand what the pathways might be to robust diplomacy. And as part of that, we have to understand the effects of sanctions on Iran's economy, how those harms can be remediated, and what a pathway looks like for Iran's economic development.
Okay, so one of the things that you try to do is to get policymakers in the West, but also in Iran to kind of see eye to eye. And I think when most people think Iran, they think of a country that doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with the Western world. Can you give us some context here? How did we get here? Because if you spoke to someone 100 years ago, I wouldn't necessarily think that they would think that Iran would be the state that it is today.
I think, well, it's a big question. I think there's a couple things that we can think about here. Iran faces two fundamental challenges, and it has faced these challenges for more than 100 years, basically its whole modern history. The first challenge is that it is a country that needs to find a model of economic development while being primarily one of the world's largest oil producers. And as you both know, when you're a major oil producer, when you have big natural resource sort of potential, it can also be a curse. It makes it very difficult to create a diversified economy. It makes it difficult to create an economy that is equitable, that delivers welfare broadly across different parts of society. And that has been a challenge for Iran from the moment, basically, that oil was found in the country around 100 years ago. The other challenge Iran faces, being in the Middle East, which is a complicated region with its own geopolitical significance, aside from the fact that it's a major source of global energy, is that Iran has struggled to find a pathway for its own sovereignty and security in that region, like many countries in the region. It has had a hard time finding a common understanding with its neighbors over what security regionally should look like. And of course, it's had a hard time trying to assert its own interests relative to the world powers. The UK and Russia and France were major players in the Middle East in the early part of the 20th century. After World War II, obviously, we ended up in a US-dominated kind of global arena, and the US played a major role in Iran's history as well, supporting the then monarchy. And these two challenges, the challenge of economic development and the challenge of sovereignty and security, really came to a head in the revolution in 1979. When an Islamic republic was established after the Shah was forced out of power. And for the last 40-some years, the Islamic Republic has tried to define a unique model of governance that is theocratic in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it's very similar to the governance of other developing countries. And this has led to both good outcomes. There have been, I think, some successes in raising living standards in Iran, delivering opportunity to ordinary people. But of course, the thing that we hear about more often are the significant challenges and failures. So at the moment, the Islamic Republic is a country where the state, the government, is in a lot of conflict with society. There are serious doubts over the viability of this model of governance moving forward. And at the same time, of course, we've had a number of years of tension between the US and Iran around how exactly Iran's presence in the region might impact US national security interests. So taking all of this together, this kind of long historical baggage, but also kind of these present tensions, we see Iran frequently in the news as a country that is in crisis. And the question is, what will it take to create better headlines about Iran and make the country more normal, quote unquote?
So the history, would it be fair to say that the history of the sanctions regime starts with the revolution?
That's fair, because the revolution in 1979, which also led to a really unique episode in US-Iran relations, which was this hostage crisis, where the US embassy was stormed and a number of individuals in that embassy were kept as hostages, I think for more than 400 days, but everyone should double check that. And, the significance of that was that Iran was a country that up until that point was seen as a US ally. The Shah was, although he did have disagreements with the US, ultimately he was supported and to a large extent armed by the United States, and Iran was seen as part of the US's balancing against the Soviet Union in the region. But the hostage crisis and the ascendance of an Islamic government in Iran really changed that. And you had very importantly, a situation where every night, basically, for the duration of the hostage crisis, I think it was Ted Koppel would give a broadcast where he would count the days of the hostage crisis on the nightly news. And this really, I think, created a new perception of Iran in the United States as a country that was dangerous, was anti-American in its sentiments. And those perceptions persisted and continued to be kind of the way that the US saw Iran. And so in the aftermath of the hostage crisis, the US introduced the first primary sanctions against Iran, seizing Iranian assets in the US and also basically banning US persons from doing business with Iran. But the sanctions were then expanded during the Clinton administration in the mid-90s. When Iran started to be seen as a country that maybe threatened U.S. interests in other ways, possibly as a country that was an exporter of terrorism, possibly as a country that was engaging in the early stages of nuclear proliferation. All of this accelerated in the tail end of the Bush administration and certainly during the Obama administration. Really, the U.S.-Iran relationship, I think, reached a new kind of nadir in the Obama administration when the US imposed the strongest ever sanctions on Iran, starting in around 2012, as part of a multilateral campaign. And we've sort of been living in that era ever since. And Iran is today still basically under the same kinds of sanctions that were introduced in the Obama years.
So that's very interesting, and I can kind of see a parallel here between Iran and perhaps Vietnam, right? So Vietnam was also, at least nominally, the southern part, a U.S. ally, and then things didn't quite go the way the U.S. policymakers envisaged. So Vietnam was a big, it played a big role in the national trauma of the U.S. And if we fast forward to today, Vietnam remains a single-party communist state. Nevertheless, Vietnam-U.S. relationships are very different than Iran-U.S. relationships, and Vietnam is a growing and very active member of the global economy, whereas Iran is not. So, in the last 50 years, and I appreciate this is a slightly vague question, what went so differently for Iran? What were the challenges that made it very, very uniquely difficult for Iran and the US to get closer?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison to Vietnam is actually a really smart one, because I think it illustrates the alternate political reality that we can envision for Iran. As you mentioned, Vietnam is still sort of nominally a communist country, although it is adopting more and more sort of a market-based economy approach. And the U.S. deems it strategically important to have good relations with Vietnam to try and counterbalance Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. One really concrete example I can bring up is that I believe that the first U.S. ambassador to Vietnam was a former prisoner of war. So the analogy we can draw with Iran is, what is the scenario that we could imagine where a former hostage in the Iran hostage crisis became the first U.S. ambassador in Iran? And it's worth noting that, there are no normalized diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran. There's no embassy in Tehran. Iran is unusual in the degree of its isolation from the U.S. The U.S. has difficult relations with a lot of countries, but it does not lack an embassy in most of those countries, and it is not applying huge sanctions on most of those countries. So Vietnam is actually an instructive kind of counterfactual for what relations could look like with a country that has a really heavy presence in the American sort of psyche. I think the difference is that every instance in which it looked like Iran and the US could finally break through and put some of that baggage aside, those attempts were derailed. So first you had it in the mid-90s when it looked like there was a genuine effort on the part of then President Rafsanjani to extend a kind of olive branch to the US. Iran had come out of the Iran-Iraq War, which was a devastating conflict, the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Iran had significant grievances because the US had, in many respects, sort of backed Iraq in that conflict. But Rafsanjani saw an opportunity to reset ties with the US very pragmatically. And the thing he brought forward was an offer, a business offer, to basically award the first contracts for an international oil company to develop assets in Iran to a US company, ConocoPhillips. But when the Republican Congress got wind of the fact that this was on the table, they basically forced Clinton's hand to issue the first set of sanctions on Iran that were secondary sanctions. So not only sanctions preventing US entities from engaging with Iran, but sanctions that were expressly designed to isolate Iran in the international financial system by also preventing non-US companies that wish to transact with US counterparts from engaging in business with Iran. Now, at the time, this really kind of peeved the Europeans, and there was this whole controversy around the extraterritoriality of US sanctions. How could the Americans dictate to the Europeans, who were making good headway in reestablishing business ties with Iran, that they can't do business in Iran if they want to do business with the US? And there was kind of a negotiated agreement there where the Europeans were allowed to continue working with Iran as part of the Clinton-era sanctions. So there was a derailing in the mid-90s. In the early 2000s, you had President Khatami, who was very kind of reform-minded, tried to change Iran's status and the perception of Iran in the global community. And he similarly kind of tried to extend an olive branch to the US, notably after 9/11, being one of the first countries to tell the Americans through back channels, look, we will help you here, and we will help try and address the issue with the Taliban. Unfortunately, the Bush administration didn't go for that. It was seen as anathema that they would potentially work with the Iranians. And for reasons that remain unclear, Bush decided to go and, in his State of the Union, lump Iran in with Iraq and North Korea as part of the axis of evil. And so this gave tremendous fodder to hardliners in Iran to say, why do we keep trying to make better relations with the Americans? They fundamentally don't like us. They think that, they want to invade us or take us off the map the way that they want to take Saddam off the map. And so from the period following basically the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Iranians always worried that they were next on the list. And in some ways, that was a very reasonable fear, not only because of the neoconservative movement in the US, but also because increasingly you had vocal leaders in Israel who saw Iran as a regional hegemon that they needed to deal with and who wanted to find ways to curtail Iranian power. So then we were derailed under Bush. In some respects, Obama was a successful reset and a breakthrough. You had a moderate president in Rouhani who was elected after the basically fiasco of the Green Revolution when the Iranian authorities basically fraudulently took an election away from the reformist candidate. In 2013, Rouhani was elected kind of as a course correction, and he promised to fix Iran's relations with the world. At that point, Iran had come under significant sanctions. By 2016, there was a long period of negotiation. You finally got a nuclear deal, really historic deal, a multilateral deal, P5+1, so the Security Council and Germany negotiating with Iran, but really led by the US. And you had a robust agreement that exchanged two things. Iran promised to curtail its nuclear program, which had made significant advancements up until that point, in exchange for substantial sanctions relief. And that deal was working for about a year because it was implemented in January 2016, and Trump was elected in November of that same year. And Trump, of course, had promised during the campaign to tear up the nuclear deal. And so you had another setback. So even when the diplomatic breakthrough happened, you had another setback. We can continue to the Biden administration years. They were very close to a deal in the summer of 2022. For various reasons, it didn't come to pass with the hardline Iranian government at the time, led by Ebrahim Raisi. But this is kind of my very long answer to say that there have been attempts at getting over this historical baggage so that we could get to an outcome that looks more like Vietnam. But for reasons related to Iran and the craziness of the Middle East, it just hasn't worked out.
So it seems to me like the US is really struggling to overcome this baggage. And there's a lot of key power players in the US that don't necessarily want any sort of renormalization of relationships with Iran. Now, I'm a little bit more familiar with the Cuba story. And with Cuba, I understand that, first of all, Cuba is a very small country of less than 10 million people. So ultimately, it doesn't matter that much for US foreign policy. Secondly, there is a very important minority of Cuban emigres in Florida. And Florida happens to be electorally a very important state. So I kind of understand the power dynamics within the US as to why the US has struggled so much to sort the normalized situation with Cuba. Nevertheless, with Iran, it's not entirely clear to me what are the key factors why there's important power players in the US that really don't want the relationships to improve.
So all the factors that are there with Cuba are there with Iran. The problem with Iran is that you have other additional factors that are significant in creating this kind of political paralysis. So like Cuba, there's also a diaspora community, Iranian diaspora in Europe and the US, that very rightly has serious concerns about policies of engagement with Iran because they see Iran, the Iranian authorities, basically violating the rights of ordinary Iranians by suppressing protests, by failing to protect the rights of women, and also failing to protect the rights of minorities. So you have an increasingly securitized state and a repressive apparatus in Iran. And when that apparatus shows its force, it creates real concerns over human rights that the diaspora points to and says, look, can we really engage a country that seems incorrigible? And that's, I think, a valid set of political concerns that have increasingly gained purchase in European capitals and in Washington. So that's one issue that is somewhat similar to Cuba. The other issue is that because it has been so long that the US has not engaged Iran in any other manner than containment, it is difficult to mobilize resources in a way to create a constructive policy. So much the same way that US firms have not been present in Cuba for a very long time, and the Obama administration, when it loosened sanctions on Cuba, actually struggled to mobilize US firms to re-engage. That's now become the same problem for Iran, and it's a problem, frankly, for pretty much every country under a major sanctions program now, that at some point, once you've isolated a country for too long, the only kind of models of policy that remain kind of relevant are those of security, where you see the country as a threat, not as an opportunity. And so this is something that I think will require tremendous work. And even when the nuclear deal was implemented, the US primary sanctions were not lifted. It was only the secondary sanctions. So in a sense, the US delivered a deal, but was counting on European and other global companies to step in and deliver the economic benefit that Iran was expecting. And so it was kind of deputizing a big part of that diplomacy to other actors, which isn't great because at the end of the day, if you're a multinational company based in Europe and you want to work in Iran, you can't just pick up the phone and call a stakeholder in the US government and get a green light and get guidance and support. And so it created this kind of strange situation where the US wanted something to happen, but lacked the tools in its policy toolkit to make it happen. And this is something that's now commonplace with all sanctioned countries. The specific things to Iran that I think make the problem even more intractable than in Cuba is that fundamentally there is a hard security concern around how Iran has positioned itself in the region. So as I mentioned, after 2003, when Iran was in the axis of evil and saw its powerful neighbor Iraq invaded, suddenly you had tremendous amounts of US force, not only in Iraq, also in Afghanistan, and based in the Gulf states. And you also had a staunch US ally in Israel with a tremendous military capacity of its own. And so Iran basically felt encircled. And rightly or wrongly, Iranian leaders believed that there was a genuine threat of military intervention. Even in the run-up to the diplomacy around the nuclear deal, the Obama administration continued to signal that if the diplomacy failed, military options were on the table. There were joint military exercises with Israel in that period to demonstrate capacity to carry out those kinds of airstrikes and perhaps other kinetic action. So how did Iran respond? I mean, basically, starting in the early 2000s, it really doubled down on a policy that Iranian security leaders call forward defense. They weren't going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the conventional forces of the Gulf states, of Israel, and certainly not the US. And so what they developed is other kinds of capacity. And so when we talk about Iranian-backed groups in Palestine, such as Hamas, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, in Yemen, the Houthis, and the paramilitary units in Iraq, these are all examples of Iran's forward defense strategy. Basically, Iran realized that the way it could develop some deterrence is to support non-state groups or quasi-state groups in countries across the region and basically make clear that there was asymmetrical capabilities here where, let's say, Israel was to consider a military strike on Iranian territory, Iran could respond using not necessarily assets directly from its own territory, although recently we did see that happen, which is a new aspect of this doctrine. But generally speaking, the deterrence has been that Iran could respond with assets elsewhere in the region, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iraq. And so from the US standpoint, the conflict here is that basically Iran has supported groups that have been on the other side of the front lines from US soldiers And particularly during the Iraq campaign, Iran was supporting groups that were responsible for the deaths of U.S. servicemen. And so from the standpoint of, why is it that so many leaders in the U.S. find it very difficult to engage Iran or talk about having a constructive policy towards Iran? It's because of the legacy of this conflict. These are two players that have been involved in indirect, basically, conflict for the better part of the last 20 years in the region. And to the extent that the U.S. sees its national security interests dependent on a robust presence in the Middle East, Iran has considered that unacceptable. Iran's view is that the U.S. needs to leave the region, and the regional countries need to figure out amongst themselves a new understanding of how security can be guaranteed. It's been interesting in the last few years that we're sort of moving in that direction as the U.S. withdraws from Iraq and now has withdrawn from Afghanistan. But still, there is significant tension between the two sides.
It'd be great to understand, Yao, what would it look like and feel like to be on the end of these US sanctions as an Iranian? And can you give us a sense of the scale of these sanctions as well?
Yeah, so they are the strongest sanctions ever imposed on any country. Now, I say that emphatically because actually when the Russia sanctions program was being rolled out starting in February 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine, those sanctions were frequently described as the strongest ever sanctions. They were the most numerous sanctions ever applied on one country. So you had more entities, more individuals sanctioned than you did in Iran in a short period of time. But they weren't as strong. And a couple quick ways of illustrating this: Russia has still been able to export oil globally under a price cap arrangement. Iran is, from the standpoint of U.S. secondary sanctions, basically unable to export oil to any country except for China, which knowingly is violating those sanctions and can get away with it. The other example here is that it wasn't until December of last year that rather quietly the Biden administration extended secondary sanctions on a larger part of the Russian economy. So these are those sanctions that say, if you want to do business with Russia and you're a non-US company, you can't do business with the US. You risk being sanctioned yourself. And so that was a relatively late addition. Those types of sanctions are central to the Iran sanctions program. And it's why Iran is significantly more isolated financially and in terms of just general trade flows than Russia has been since the invasion. So the strength of the sanctions matters because it explains the outcomes that we've seen in Iran. And to kind of make it more concrete for the listeners about, what does it mean to live under sanctions this way? I think, again, it's important to think about counterfactuals. What would have happened if the sanctions had not been applied? And basically, between the early 90s and 2012, an ordinary Iranian had a totally reasonable expectation that their economic welfare would continue to improve year in, year out. And the Iranian economy was by no means perfect. It had mismanagement like many developing economies. It was a bit imbalanced, very volatile because it remained dependent on oil. But it was delivering prosperity to ordinary people, and basically living standards were rising to the extent that there was not a single year of recession between the early 90s and 2012. The first major recession Iran faces in this period after the Iran-Iraq War comes in basically late 2012, early 2013, as a response to the major financial and energy sanctions the Obama administration imposes in December of 2011. And what essentially happened is a balance of payments crisis for Iran. A country that was exporting a lot of oil was suddenly not able to export as much oil. The currency began to lose value because the foreign exchange earnings of the government were plummeting. You had a fiscal crisis because oil revenues were a major part of government budgets, and the government basically turned to monetizing its deficit. It printed money in order to kind of keep things going. And the net effect of all of this was significant inflation. And so you started to see this cycle that we've seen in Iran since then of basically chronic high inflation. Not quite as dramatic as what we've seen in Venezuela. Iran is still actually a functional economy and has in recent years shown an ability to show modest growth under sanctions. But the net effect of this inflation was basically downward pressure on the welfare of ordinary households. Households that used to basically have rising purchasing power no longer had rising purchasing power, and the middle class started to lose out a lot of what it had gained in the previous sort of 20 years. And there's sort of two outcomes I would describe. One is, in absolute terms, you've had an increase in poverty in Iran. So more households, middle-class households, have lost their economic standing and fallen into what we would typically consider kind of a working-class level of welfare. And then a lot of working-class households have fallen below the poverty line. And this is a dramatic reversal in a country where, again, people had a reasonable expectation that their kids would be doing better than them, that, they'd be able to afford more kind of comforts and take advantage of more opportunities as the economy in the country grew. The second outcome is related to that. It's that the economy has, in the research I've done, also working with a colleague named Zeb Kalb, a sociologist, we've basically identified that the distribution of wealth in Iran has changed. So the economic pie is not growing, which is a problem, but also what changes is that how the existing wealth in the country is divvied up has shifted. And basically, elites are enjoying a larger portion of the economic pie at the expense of the middle class and the working class. So a country that was developing economically imperfectly, but it was, and converging with other countries in the region and global kind of actually outperforming most similar countries in the world, became a country that was significantly underperforming, where basically the economic benefits of development are being distributed less fairly than they used to be.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the secondary sanctions? They sound really interesting because it seems like Russia's been able to get away with it by exporting to different partners, whereas because of the secondary sanctions, there is no alternative to Iran. I read a case where BA flights and Air France are being cancelled because of these secondary sanctions. Do you have some more examples and and bring it to life?
Yeah, so the main thing I think to emphasize is that sanctions bite because of their consequences on financial transactions, which is, I think, very kind of germane for this podcast. But literally, they are pushing the country that is targeted to the margins of the global financial system. In general, since the global financial crisis, we have had a phenomenon of de-risking in global finance. Banks are reducing their exposure to high-risk jurisdictions, even countries that are not sanctioned but are seen as high risk because of maybe money laundering concerns, terrorism financing concerns. And so there's been a decline in global correspondent banking relationships. So fewer banks in the West, major banks, are connected to counterparts in developing countries. Now, the sanctions basically say explicitly to those banks, if you transact with a financial institution in the Iranian financial system, you will get cut out from the US financial system. And for any global bank, that's existential, because it means that you are unlikely to be able to do dollar clearing. You're unlikely going to be able to serve the majority of your clients who do want to transact with the US financial system because of how important it is in the global economy. And so essentially, banks make a very simple judgment. There's no point in trying to engage a sanctioned economy because it will have all of these negative effects on the rest of their business. Importantly, I would highlight that this even extends to areas where the trade is permitted. So as part of all major sanctions programs, there are exemptions and licenses covering humanitarian trade. But because of this effect on the willingness of banks to do business with sanctioned countries, even permissible trade doesn't get done. So Iran has a much harder time importing food and medicine than it should, because even in those areas, there are simply no, very, very few Western banks that are willing to do direct payments with an Iranian correspondent, either as the making a payment to Iran, for example, if they need to purchase something that's being exported, or more likely receiving a payment from Iran for a good that's being sold to an Iranian buyer. And so Iran ends up very isolated, and you can see this clearly in the trade data. Iran's largest trading partners were the EU and China. Trade with the EU fell dramatically because the EU was not buying oil and it wasn't selling the things it used to sell, largely machinery and electrical appliances, also automobiles, to the Iranian market. China stepped in for a time, and there was a growth in Iran's trade with China. But even there, as the secondary sanctions tightened, trade between China and Iran today is lower than what it was in 2014. So you see that even Chinese multinational companies are wary of secondary sanctions because, if you're, let's say, a major Chinese automaker, you now have global ambitions, and that includes working in markets that are very connected to the US. It may even include working with US counterparts directly. You can't risk a secondary sanctions kind of exposure. And so even they have scaled back from working with Iran.
What do the Iranians' plans involve in order to get round or counter some of the sanctions? You mentioned some things about trying to destabilize the area, the region with the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas. I imagine maybe there's a different attitude to the nuclear program. If you could give us some examples of how they're reacting, that'd be really interesting. Sure.
So I don't actually think that the Iranian policy response was the optimal one. And to give you an example, in the face of fiscal pressures, the Iranian economic policymakers actually adopted a kind of austerity policy where they were very focused on addressing inefficiencies and waste in government budgets, for example, by doing subsidy reform. But they sort of missed the bigger picture, which is that you need to actually compensate for the shock of sanctions in the economy, perhaps by increasing investment, which is something that has languished basically in the sanctions period. So that is, I think, one aspect here of why the top-down approach hasn't really worked. This was a really thorny problem for Iranian economic policymakers. There weren't many large industrialized economies that have been under this kind of pressure. And so they were just trying to figure it out as they went along. And I think they made some mistakes. To the extent that the Iranian economy has proven resilient to sanctions, it has really been a bottom-up process. And what we see is that you have a relatively developed economy with a large private sector. And although the oil sector contracted significantly in the face of sanctions because you have a state oil company that was primarily selling to a small number of global customers, the Iranian manufacturing base was very domestically oriented. And what basically happened is you had a couple interesting phenomena. First, the withdrawal of foreign companies from the market meant that domestic players had a larger market share they could fight for, and they actually, in some cases, increased their production. So I'm working on a paper right now with an Iranian economist where we're looking at the rapid growth in home appliances production in Iran when the two big Korean players, Samsung and LG, had to withdraw during the Trump years. And so there were some domestic opportunities, which is kind of an import substitution story. But I think more importantly, the other phenomenon we see is that manufacturing firms in Iran could take advantage of one of the key effects of the sanctions, which was currency devaluation, which basically made Iranian products more competitive in regional markets. And so for the first time, a country that had kind of gone through what economists call Dutch disease, where a single, very lucrative natural resource that can be exported leads to the diminishment of other parts of the economy, that Dutch disease got reversed a little bit. And you had Iranian manufacturers starting to export food products, consumer goods, and some basic kind of consumer durables, like appliances, into regional markets like the UAE, Afghanistan, Iraq. And so this was kind of the lifeline for the Iranian economy, this bottom-up resilience. The other way to think about it is that you have around 20 million households in Iran. And, you know, a lot of people, when sanctions are applied to a country, assume that almost necessarily there's going to be economic collapse. And sometimes that does play out because it can be highly disruptive to the functioning of an economy. But fundamentally, people try and get by during economic crises. I mean, we saw it during the global financial crisis, and we can think of it, for example, in terms of the economic shock of COVID. It's not like people just wake up, decide the country's sanctioned, and give up. They still go to work, even if their real wage is declining. They try and keep their business afloat as much as they can if it's their primary source of income. And this is basically where the resilience comes from. Households just can't give up. And so the fundamental economic activity of 20 million households in Iran, there's real value there. Iran is what you can call a real economy. It's not, a tiny petrostate. It's a big diversified economy. And so that was a big part of the resilience. Just briefly on the kind of second dimension of your question. So the second aspect of the strategy was basically generate leverage. Iranian leaders understand that at some point they do want these sanctions lifted. And we actually see confirmation of that essentially in the way that the recent presidential election has played out. Prior to that, we actually see indications of that in the fact that a very hardline president in Raisi also pursued diplomacy with the US. So there is still this idea that, look, if we can get the sanctions lifted on agreeable terms, let's do it. But in order to do that, you need leverage at the negotiating table. And Iran's leverage has come in two forms. It has come in significantly escalating its nuclear program to the extent where a lot of nuclear policy experts consider Iran a threshold nuclear state today, a state that knows how to build a nuclear weapon if it's so decided. They have not made that decision yet, and that's a very important threshold that has not yet been crossed, but they are at the threshold. And the second way they've generated leverage is by basically continuing to invest in the forward defense policy. And to the extent that they have demonstrated capacities in recent years that have actually forced US allies in the region that broke relations with Iran in 2016, again, right around that time when the nuclear deal was implemented, namely the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. Qatar maintained relations, but UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and also Egypt, which is outside of the GCC. Those countries are now reestablishing ties with Iran and talking to Iran because they've come to realize that the forward defense is a reality of the region. These groups are no longer fully controlled by Iran. They're embedded in the local context in Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen. So if you are going to have some influence over them through the Iranian connection, you need to talk to Iran. And that leverage, I think, is playing out in Iran's favor. It's basically the idea that, look, if we have legitimate security concerns on both sides, let's talk about those concerns. And Iran has made sure that everyone has had to care about the threats that they can also create for their neighbors.
I'd love to hear some more of these nitty-gritty anecdotes with regards to the bottom-up adaptations to sanctions, because you mentioned, for instance, that Iran has been able to export appliances, agricultural goods, other things to regional markets. But of course, if you're an importer in the UAE, it's not exactly like you can get a bank deposit sent to Iran either. So can you give us perhaps a few anecdotes of how the Iranian people, not necessarily the Iranian policymakers, but how the Iranian people have managed to adapt to sanctions?
Yeah, it's, it's part of the pernicious effect of the sanctions, and it's not something to be celebrated when they are circumvented, because the way that that often happens is through the expansion of essentially a gray market. So I'll give you a concrete example. In the period when the nuclear deal was being implemented and the secondary sanctions that had been lifted, a number of the major global logistics companies reestablished routes to Iran from the major port in the region, which is Dubai. So Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC, started serving Iran again. Maersk started serving Iran again, and a number of the Korean ones as well. And so if you were to, basically either try and get big cargo into Iran or export from Iran, you had huge, cargo ships arriving at Iranian ports, and you were able to do things cost effectively. Where are we now? Basically, all of those big players pulled out when the sanctions were reimposed by the Trump administration starting in May of 2018, and then fully in November of that year. And so you have these kind of ad hoc solutions that have emerged. A lot more reliance on road exports, basically by road through the border with Iraq, which, is effective if you're trying to do trade with Iraq, but it's not effective if you're trying to trade with the global markets. There are fundamental bottlenecks there. Literally, trucks stopped at the border until customs can review them. It's a physical bottleneck. Similarly, for Dubai, if you go to the port, you'll see these kind of traditional dhows that are at the harbor in Bourse Dubai and Old Dubai. And if you could, and you can just go up to the kind of guys loading the ships and just say, like, where is this stuff going? And they'll tell you it's going to Iran. And they're, putting plasma TVs on there, printers, refrigerators, sometimes. And they often come back from Iran with things like goats or fruits or, something that is kind of in demand from in the UAE, which has all the fineries, but not necessarily food and other more low value goods. So this trade continues, but it continues in this kind of old, almost with a regional lexicon that has existed for hundreds of years. I mean, this is the other funny thing about this trade, is that it reminds us that even if you sanction a country, it doesn't become like a planet in another universe. It is still embedded in the region. And so the trade that is persisting between Iran and its neighbors today, I mean, it's the same trade that was existing 200, 300, 400 years ago, between the same routes and often in a similar fashion. So there is that kind of embeddedness that allows some of this to continue, but it is trade that is less regularized. It is trade that is less efficient. It's trade that's more expensive. So one of the things that Iranian firms will complain about is that they basically face higher transaction costs. If they do find financial services companies that will help them using what Iranians call a saraf system, or in Arabic a hawala system, where basically you have kind of no cross-border payments, but you have the ability to exchange value across two economies by having an exchange bureau that's netting payments in and out with a ledger in one country and a ledger in another. Those systems work. They've been around for hundreds of years, but they are expensive. And getting foreign currency to do those payments is also challenging. And so, Iran is a country where right now, if you want to basically send money abroad or receive money from abroad, it's not unheard of for a company to be facing a transaction cost of, 7%, basically. When it should be less than half of that in normal times. And that, is a real headwind if you're trying to scale a business, if you're trying to manage kind of your business given the existing economic conditions. So there are solutions, but they're imperfect and they're not to be celebrated because they represent a kind of economic stagnation or even regression for Iran.
A bad equilibrium,
Exactly.
if you could say. The other thing that you mentioned, financial markets and transaction costs when doing business, sending money abroad or receiving money from abroad. But at the end of the day, you've got approximately 80, 90 million Iranians in a country that was at some point quite industrialized, or maybe is now at the peak of its industrialization. In any case, Iranians have pensions, they have insurance, they have mortgages, they have all sorts of things that we have as well, except that they're not linked to the global financial system. There's a stock market, there's all sorts of things that kind of semi-exist in isolation from the global financial system. And we're so used to seeing them as one big global consolidated market. So how do these consumer financial markets work in Iran? How do Iranian consumers manage their savings, their mortgages, all of these financial services?
So it's really interesting because there has been a lot of development in the financial sector in Iran under sanctions. And in some ways, the sanctions turbocharged that development, namely because it introduced a new urgent kind of need for Iranian consumers, which was, how do you hedge against inflation? And this is basically the thing that is weighing the most on an Iranian household. You are earning a wage, but the annual inflation in recent years has been, over 40%. And so that unless you convert your real wage that you're earning into something that is going to appreciate, you're going to take a major haircut in terms of what you're actually earning and what's underpinning your purchasing power. And so there have been various strategies that Iranian households have taken. Some of them are pretty simple, like historically you would go and you would buy hard currency. So there are exchange bureaus in major Iranian cities that will sell you physical dollars or euros or pounds. And so this is one reason why the free market exchange rate tends to rise so much when there is instability in the country or when sanctions are being tightened. Basically, households are going and buying up dollars, and that's raising the demand for dollars, and there's limited supply, so the price of the dollar relative to the rial skyrockets. Iranians will also buy gold coins. That's another popular store of value. They will buy real estate, and there has been enormous appreciation in basically real estate prices in Iran's major cities, because that's seen as a safe store of value. Even used cars actually become a store of value because for two reasons. One is it's like a pretty big asset that's useful. The second reason is that sanctions actually have, in multiple instances, led to shortages in the production of automobiles. So the industrial partners for Iran's automobile industry in the late 90s, early 2000s were basically French and German automakers. When they pulled out, and for other reasons related to availability of raw materials and machinery, Iran's automotive production declined, and so you're not making enough cars. So used cars actually...
Just a quick anecdote there. In Cuba, those terribly old American 50s cars, exactly, sometimes even 30s cars that you see on the street, those are actually worth tens of thousands of dollars. Those are worth more than the new car in the US, simply because getting in new cars, this has changed a little bit in the last few years, but simply because getting in new cars is so difficult and so expensive.
Exactly. So it's a problem we see in a number of countries. And so these were all basically hedges against inflation: gold, hard currency, real estate, used cars. But there was one more thing that developed and really became kind of a more sophisticated phenomenon financially in the country, which is that there was a stock exchange in Iran active even before the sanctions were applied. But the sanctions have had the really interesting effect of basically acting like capital controls. And so money that would previously have flown out, particularly money from high net worth individuals people like business owners who are actually quite sort of cash rich that would previously have been put in an apartment in France or a bank account in Switzerland or, some kind of investment vehicle somewhere. That money kind of had to stay in Iran. It's not that wealthy people can't get their money out. There are ways of doing it, but there are lots of wealthy people in Iran. There are people that have gotten even wealthier under sanctions. And so if you consider the bottlenecks in terms of getting money out of the country, a lot of that money has to stay in Iran. And the question is, where do you put it for it to actually appreciate? And so there was the development of a relatively sophisticated asset management kind of industry in Iran, where you had brokerages and actually fully fledged investment managers emerge to help Iranians channel their savings into different kinds of securities. And the stock market grew dramatically in terms of its overall capitalization in that period. You had more companies IPOing. In fact, in the year in which the Trump sanctions were tightened the most, 2019 into 2020, the Iranian stock market was the best performing market in the world in real terms. And actually, if you look at the Iranian stock market in the long view of around, let's say, 20 years, and you calculate the return, the CAGR in euro terms, and also control for inflation, it's basically outperformed the S&P 500. There are reasons for that. It's not just money pouring into the market, although that's a big part of it. Actually, Iranian firms have demonstrated an ability to increase their profitability under sanctions, and there's various reasons related to that I think relate to market power. There's less competition, they can price kind of at will, and they take advantage. But in the end, the point here is that you've had this expansion of the stock market. And when the stock market started to grow, those middle-class families that previously maybe were relying more on gold or hard currency or some real estate if they could afford it, started to also invest in the stock market. So it got a little bit of a flywheel effect. There have been kind of concerns that this is a bubble in some ways, but the reality is that because the sanctions function like capital controls, the bubble, there's no real way for the bubble to burst. Because even if you tried to take your money out, there's no other kind of place where that money could flow. Interestingly, and to close this point, similar dynamics are visible in Russia right now. And so for the immediate period after the sanctions, one of the peculiar things was that the Russian stock market was actually doing okay. And some economists who work on Russia, who are trying to think more creatively about sanctions, have similarly pointed out the problem that sanctions are functioning like capital controls. Why are we making it hard for Russians to take their money out of the country? Maybe that's actually a better outcome than trapping the wealth in the country and wondering why the economy isn't collapsing.
Yeah. I take it that if Alex and I decided that we wanted part of the action and we wanted to invest in the Iranian stock exchange, that wouldn't be trivially easy to do.
You couldn't do it, but that is the real shame, because actually one of the things that was occurring when the nuclear deal was implemented is that there were attempts by Iranian asset managers to partner with foreign firms to draw foreign capital into the market. There are a couple instances in which that did successfully happen. There are a couple managers that historically were managing European money in the market. That money is kind of trapped now because you can't divest and then repatriate the money. So tough luck for those investors. But it's not that they've lost money. It's just that their money has trapped. But that really would have been one of the things that could have helped restore Iran's connections to the global economy, bringing in that financial capital into the Iranian capital markets, and creating these kind of positive incentive structures where basically if you run the country well, if you grow the economy, you can draw in more foreign capital, that makes the economy grow more, so on and so forth. And I think Iran is, to an extent, looking at other developing economies and realizing that it has been left behind. So if you compare Iran to like kind of the sort of golden child of the class, which is South Korea, part of the issue here is that neither can foreign money flow in, nor can Iranian firms raise money in international debt markets or IPO abroad, which were things that really could have happened and should have happened.
I've just got one more question. Assuming there are no more assassination attempts on US presidential candidates, who do you think the Iranians will be rooting for, and how important is the outcome to Iran?
So often from Iranian leaders, you hear this kind of bravura statement that it doesn't matter who's elected because whether it's a Democrat or Republican, it's all the same. And frankly, if you look at the history of US-Iran relations, I talked about the breakdown under Clinton, the breakdown under Bush. And then while we had a breakthrough with Obama, ultimately it was kind of subverted by Trump, and then Biden hasn't managed to do much better on Iran. There is some, evidence to suggest that actually some of these fundamental problems are not partisan problems. They are about a fundamental kind of political disposition in Washington, where the US has a really hard time thinking creatively about policy and pursuing constructive relations with countries it's had tensions with or conflict with. So that's one thing. That being said, when you really, I think, push them, Iranian officials will admit that it is much better for them to deal with a logical, reasonable, and predictable administration. So there had been a notion that you could do a deal with Trump. You promise him he can open a Trump hotel in Tehran and he'll give you anything you want. The North Koreans kind of tried that in really kind of feting Trump and giving him promises around economic engagement. It didn't work because I don't think there's much, there isn't much IQ there in the form of Trump himself, and ultimately it depends on the people around him. And they have tended to be people who consider it totally anathema to try and find a way of accommodating Iran or dealing with Iran in the region. So frankly, it's much more, I think we should be much more optimistic if Kamala Harris wins this election. I'll note that her National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon, knows the Iran file well, worked on Iran issues under Obama, has written about the need to be pragmatic and realistic on Iran. Personally, I think he would be a better positioned negotiator than Sullivan because of some of his priors. And what we should take as optimistic is that Iran's foreign minister looks like it will be a gentleman named Araghchi, who was the chief negotiator of the nuclear deal. And naming him foreign minister in this new administration is a strong indication that the Iranian government wants to keep the door to diplomacy open. Let's see if they actually walk through that door and extend a hand. But I'm hopeful that there is that possibility. And if there is that possibility, it's really incumbent on the US to seize it, because we can't stay in this no deal, no crisis sort of circumstance forever.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've learned so much about all things to do with the Iranian crisis and Iranian sanctions. Let's hope for a Harris victory so we can start investing in the Iranian stock exchange quite soon.
Now that's the kind of imagination that we all need to embrace. Excellent.
Thanks. Bye-bye.